Japanese commanders were shocked that America had ships just for making ice cream, but this wasn't just about dessert. Picture this. While Japanese soldiers ate rice mixed with sawdust, rationing every grain, American sailors lined up for vanilla. Cones on floating ice cream parlors in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We're talking about converted tankers that could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, 24 hours a day, in the heart of a war zone. But here's what the Japanese commanders really understood when they learned this impossible truth. This wasn't luxury. This was a declaration of industrial supremacy so overwhelming it crushed their spirit before the first shot was fired. When kite, your enemy can spare entire ships for ice cream while you're melting railway tracks for bullets. You're not just losing battles, you're being psychologically destroyed by abundance itself. What does it mean when a nation fights a total war and still has enough resources left over for dessert? And how did frozen treats become the most devastating weapon of World War II? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heat clung to everything aboard the USS Lexington like a living thing. Salt sweat soaked through Bobby Keller's uniform, and the steel decks radiated heat like stovetops beneath his boots. He leaned against the railing, watching the endless Pacific stretch toward a horizon that shimmered with heat waves, and thought about the hand-cranked ice cream maker back on his family's farm in Iowa. That old wooden bucket with its metal canister had been the centerpiece of every summer Sunday after church. His mother would send him to the ice house for a 50-pound block. His father would position rock salt around the edges, and Bobby would take turns with his sisters cranking the handle until his arms ached. The reward was always peach ice cream, made with fruit from their own trees, sweet and cold enough to make his teeth hurt. That was another world now. Life aboard a carrier meant powdered eggs that tasted like chalk, bread hard enough to break teeth, and endless pots of coffee so strong it could strip paint. Dessert, when it came at all, was lime jello or canned fruit cocktail floating in syrup that had turned the color of rust. Nobody dreamed of ice cream out here, not in the middle of a war, not with kamikazes diving out of the sun and torpedoes cutting silver wakes through the water. Ice cream belonged to peacetime, to front porches and church socials and lazy afternoons when the biggest worry was whether the cream would whip properly. Yet word had started spreading through the ship like wildfire. Rumors passed from sailor to sailor during watch changes and mess hall conversations. Somewhere out there in the Pacific, they said, the Navy had found a way. Ships that existed for no other purpose than making ice cream. Floating parlors that could churn out gallons while shells exploded overhead. Bobby wanted to believe it, but the idea crashed against everything he knew about war. Every rivet on the ship had a purpose. Every gallon of fuel, every pound of steel, every man aboard existed to fight. The idea that somewhere someone had decided ice cream was important enough to build ships around seemed like a fairy tale told by men who had been at sea too long. But he held on to the rumor anyway, turning it over in his mind like a lucky coin. It wasn't just about the ice cream itself. It was what it represented, a taste of home, a reminder that even in the middle of death and destruction, life still had sweetness worth fighting for. If America could spare ships for ice cream, then maybe this war wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about preserving a way of life where Sunday afternoons mattered as much as battlefields. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of peach ice cream. Bobby stared across the water, salt spray misting his face, and whispered, "To no one?" Impossible. 3,000 miles away, Lieutenant Haruo Matsumoto straightened the stack of papers under the dim glow of an oil lamp in his Tokyo office. The ration report spread across his desk told a story of mounting desperation. Rice stretched thin with barley and millet, portions cut in half again, soldiers surviving on 1,800 calories a day when they needed 3,000. Even officers were going hungry. His pen scratched across rice paper as he traced the numbers that haunted his sleep. Shipping losses mounted daily. 60% of merchant vessels now rested on the ocean floor. Steel was so scarce they had begun melting railway lines to forge aircraft parts. Fuel shortages grounded half the remaining air fleet. Every page screamed the same truth. Japan was starving. Then a translated intelligence brief slid across his desk, stamped with the red seal that marked priority intercepts. American radio transmissions decoded by the cryptography section. Most contained routine operational orders, weather reports, casualty notifications. But this one made him stop breathing. The Americans, according to intercepted communications, had ships producing ice cream. He read the line 3 times, certain the translators had made an error. Ice cream was a luxury his own children had tasted perhaps twice in their lives, and then only small portions made from precious sugar and milk that should have fed a family for days. The thought that the enemy not only had enough dairy products to waste on frozen desserts, but had built entire vessels dedicated to manufacturing them, clawed at something deep in his chest. This war, he muttered to the empty room, ink bleeding through the thin paper, is not fought only with guns and planes. They are drowning us in abundance. He set down his pen and walked to the window. Outside, Tokyo huddled in darkness, windows covered to hide from American bombers. Citizens stood in ration lines that stretched for blocks, hoping for a bowl of rice mixed with sawdust. Children played in rubble-strewn streets, their ribs visible through torn clothing. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Pacific, enemy sailors complained about whether they preferred vanilla or chocolate. The mathematical impossibility of it struck him like a physical blow. Japan had mobilized every resource, stripped every luxury, sacrificed every comfort to feed the war machine. They had achieved the absolute efficiency that total war demanded, and still they were losing to an enemy so wealthy they could afford to waste ships on ice cream. Matsumoto returned to his desk and picked up his brush. His hand trembled as he wrote in careful characters, "Ships for ice cream?" The question mark bled through the paper like blood through bandages. In Racine, Wisconsin, sparks exploded from Ruth O'Malley's welding torch like tiny fireworks against the factory's steel-girded ceiling. She pressed her mask tight against her face and guided the blue flame along a seam that would hold refrigeration coils designed to freeze milk and cream thousands of miles from any cow. The plant had built farm equipment before the war, tractors, and combines that harvested wheat across the Midwest. Now the same assembly lines produced refrigeration units, industrial freezers, cooling systems that could function in tropical heat while shells exploded overhead. And according to the rumors that raced through the night shift, some were destined for ships that would make ice cream in the Pacific. Ruth didn't know if the rumors were true, but she welded each joint like her life depended on it. Her brother, Tommy, was a Marine somewhere in the Pacific, fighting his way across islands with names she couldn't pronounce. If he ever tasted what she was building, if her work brought him even a moment of comfort or home, then every blister on her hands and every ache in her shoulders was worth it. She worked 12-hour shifts alongside women who had never seen a welding torch before 1941. Farm wives and shopkeepers' daughters and college girls who discovered they could read blueprints and operate machinery with the same skill they once applied to recipes and ledgers. Their hands blistered, their hair stayed tied back in regulation kerchiefs, and their ears rang with the constant hiss of acetylene and clang of hammers. The numbers were staggering when you stopped to think about them. This plant alone produced 2,000 refrigeration units monthly. Multiply that by dozens of similar factories across the Midwest, and the scale became almost incomprehensible. Railroad cars loaded with freezers rolled west daily, bound for ports where they would be loaded onto ships that would carry them to men who might die tomorrow, but would taste ice cream today. During her lunch break, Ruth climbed to the factory's observation deck and watched freight trains disappear into the distance. Each car represented hundreds of man-hours, tons of steel, enough electrical components to power a small town. Also, soldiers could have a scoop of vanilla after watching their friends die. Some might call it waste. Ruth called it civilization. The difference between America and its enemies wasn't just military might. It was the fundamental belief that comfort mattered, that small pleasures were worth fighting for, that a nation strong enough to wage total war was also strong enough to remember why life was worth living. Sparks cascaded from her torch as she returned to work, each glowing fragment fading like stars before hitting the concrete floor. Somewhere across the ocean, identical sparks were flying from a Navy welder's torch as he installed the very equipment she was building. Commander Edward Stedman faced a room full of skeptical stares in the cramped Navy logistics office in Washington. The morning's rain drummed against windows as he spread blueprints across the mahogany conference table, detailed schematics of freezers, stainless steel churns, insulated cargo holds, and refrigeration systems that could function in 100-degree heat while bombs exploded overhead. "Gentlemen," Stedman said, his voice cutting through the murmur of disbelief, "this is not a joke. Morale is a weapon of war. Our sailors need ice cream." Admiral Richardson leaned forward, his weathered face creased with doubt. "Commander, we're losing 2 destroyers a week in the Pacific. Every ton of steel matters, every gallon of fuel, every man. And you want us to build floating ice cream parlors?" Stedman had anticipated the resistance. He pulled out a manila folder thick with statistics and spread them beside the blueprints. "Sir, these aren't ice cream parlors. They're morale multiplication platforms. Each converted barge can produce 10 gallons every 7 minutes, maintain 2,000 gallons in storage, and serve every man in a carrier group fresh ice cream weekly." The cost analysis was devastating in its simplicity. Converting a Liberty ship into an ice cream barge required less than $1 million, a rounding error compared to the $40 million needed to build a single destroyer. The refrigeration equipment cost less than a single torpedo. The monthly operating expense was smaller than the daily fuel consumption of a heavy cruiser. "Look at these numbers," Stedman continued, pointing to charts that showed comparative resource allocation. "We're already shipping 60% of the world's refrigeration equipment to the Pacific. Adding ice cream production requires increasing that figure by exactly 0.3%. The Japanese can't even manufacture basic cooling systems anymore. They're melting railway tracks to make bullets." Captain Morrison, the supply chief, studied the technical specifications. The freezing units can operate in ambient temperatures, up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Insulation rated for direct hit by shrapnel. Emergency generators ensure continuous operation even during battle conditions. "But the principle," Admiral Richardson protested, "ice cream while men are dying." Stedman's response was quiet but firm. "Sir, our boys aren't dying for the right to suffer. They're dying for the right to come home to Sunday dinners and church socials and vanilla cones on summer evenings. A man who tastes home on his tongue will fight twice as hard for the chance to taste it again." The room fell silent except for rain against glass. Finally, Admiral Richardson nodded toward the blueprints. "Show me production timelines." A naval architect in the corner began sketching modifications into the hull design of a converted tanker, his pencil adding ice cream manufacturing equipment to what had once been a cargo hold. The smell of diesel fuel hung over the converted barge like a metallic cloud, but the 300 sailors lined up along the deck didn't care. They held tin cups and mess kits, their faces mixing disbelief with anticipation as they watched Navy cooks operate the impossible machinery that had materialized in the Pacific like something from a fever dream. Bobby Keller stood 15th in line, close enough to see steam rising from the refrigeration units, close enough to hear the mechanical churning that sounded like civilization itself. The barge had appeared at their anchorage 3 days ago, a converted Liberty ship bristling with freezers and cooling towers instead of guns. Word spread through the fleet faster than radio transmissions. The Navy had done the impossible. When Bobby reached the serving station, a cook with arms like tree trunks handed him a paper cone filled with something he hadn't tasted since basic training 15 months ago. Vanilla ice cream, white as fresh paint, cold enough to shock his tongue after years of lukewarm coffee and sun-heated water. The first taste hit him like a physical blow. Sweetness so intense it was almost painful. Coldness that made his molars ache. The flavor of milk and sugar and vanilla that belonged to front porches and county fairs and afternoons when war was something that happened in other people's nightmares. Around him, hardened men who had survived kamikaze attacks and torpedo. Runs began laughing like schoolboys. Petty officers who hadn't smiled in months grinned through ice cream mustaches. Gunners who could strip a 5-inch cannon blindfolded stood speechless, staring at their cones like they held actual miracles. "Jesus Christ," whispered the sailor beside Bobby, a radio man from Kansas whose hands shook as he lifted his cone. They actually did it. Ice cream in a war zone. The statistics were as impossible as the taste. This single barge could produce enough ice cream to serve every man in the task force twice weekly. The refrigeration systems operated continuously, churning out gallons while bombs fell and planes crashed into the sea. The Navy had calculated that maintaining morale through desert was more cost-effective than replacing depressed sailors. Bobby finished his cone and immediately got back in line. The cook handed him another without question. Orders were to serve until every man had eaten his fill. Ice cream wasn't rationed here. It was abundant, unlimited, a demonstration of American industrial might that said more about the war's outcome than any battle report. As he ate his second cone, black smoke from a distant destroyer's stack drifted across the sun. War continued around them, but for this moment, sweetness had triumphed over suffering. The Navy had weaponized dessert, and victory suddenly tasted like vanilla. Lieutenant Matsumoto received the report from Lieutenant Commander Yamada, whose submarine had shadowed an American convoy for 3 days before surfacing under cover of darkness. The intelligence was so absurd that Matsumoto initially assumed his translator had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. American sailors had called across the water, boasting about their ice cream ship. They were eating frozen dessert, Yamada reported, his voice hollow with disbelief. While we watched through the periscope, paper cones filled with white cream, they threw the empty cones into the ocean like trash. Matsumoto set down his pen and stared at the wall map, where red pins marked the steady retreat of Japanese positions. Each pin represented thousands of men who ate cold rice twice daily if they were fortunate. Some subsisted on seaweed soup and whatever fish they could catch. Many had begun boiling leather to extract nutrients. His staff officers sat in uncomfortable silence. Major Tanaka, who hadn't seen his children in 8 months, cleared his throat. "Sir, our latest ration allocation provides 1,800 calories per soldier per day. American intelligence suggests their Navy provides over 4,000. The mathematics of defeat spread across Matsumoto's desk like spilled ink. While Japanese families sold furniture to buy rice, the enemy served ice cream to their sailors. While Japan melted temple bells to manufacture ammunition, America converted cargo ships into floating dessert factories. The disparity wasn't just material, it was psychological warfare of the most crushing kind. "They have so much," whispered Captain Sato, whose own son was stationed on Iwo Jima, "that they can waste entire ships on luxuries." Matsumoto picked up his brush and wrote careful characters in his daily log. "The enemy fights with abundance itself as a weapon. They demonstrate not only that they can defeat us, but that they can defeat us while maintaining the peacetime comforts. We have forgotten. This is not mere military superiority. This is the crushing weight of an entire civilization that has never known true scarcity." He paused, ink dripping onto rice paper. Outside his window, Tokyo citizens stood in lines that stretched for blocks, hoping to purchase cups of rice mixed with sawdust and ground acorns. Children played with wooden toys because metal had been confiscated for the war effort. Families burned furniture to stay warm because coal was reserved for ammunition factories. Meanwhile, American sailors threw ice cream cones into the ocean, like garbage. Matsumoto closed his leather journal, his hand trembling as he fastened the brass clasp. He had finally understood the true nature of their defeat. Japan had achieved maximum efficiency at the cost of everything that made life worth living. America had maintained both overwhelming force and the luxury to remember why they fought. Ruth's plant had transformed into a 24-hour cathedral of industrial might. The night shift arrived as the day shift departed, women passing welding, torches, and technical specifications like sacred relics in an unbroken chain of production that spanned 3 shifts, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The numbers were staggering when she stopped to calculate them. This single factory produced enough refrigeration equipment monthly to cool every home in Milwaukee. Multiply that output by 47 similar plants across the Midwest, and America was manufacturing 60% of the world's cooling capacity, while simultaneously fighting a global war. Ruth worked nights now, finding the darkness outside. The factory windows somehow appropriate for work that would be used in battles fought on the other side of the planet. The plant floor never slept. Arc welders sparked like stars, hydraulic presses thundered like artillery, and conveyor belts carried finished freezers toward loading docks where trains waited with engines running. Her brother's latest letter had mentioned the heat in the Pacific, how metal surfaces became untouchable in the afternoon sun, how fresh water was rationed, but ice cream had begun appearing on ships throughout the fleet. She welded each joint thinking about Tommy standing in line with a paper cone, tasting vanilla while planes roared overhead. The foreman, Mr. Peterson, posted production figures weekly on the bulletin board near the time clock. Last month, 2,147 refrigeration units completed. This month, they were ahead of schedule. The government had increased orders again, apparently. The Navy wanted ice cream production on hospital ships, transport vessels, even submarines, when they returned to port. During her lunch break, Ruth climbed to the observation deck and watched freight trains disappear into the prairie darkness. Each car carried enough freezers to stock a small city. Railroad crews worked around the clock to move the equipment west, toward ports where it would be loaded onto ships bound for battles that would determine whether American abundance would survive or be crushed by enemies who had forgotten what abundance meant. She thought about the women who had worked these stations before her, immigrant grandmothers who had sewn grain sacks, farm wives who had assembled tractors, seamstresses, who had stitched dresses for church socials. Now their daughters and granddaughters welded freezers that would serve ice cream to sailors, fighting for the right to return to grain sacks and tractors and church socials. The factory whistle blew, calling her back to work. Ruth adjusted her welding mask and struck an arc that blazed like a miniature sun. Sparks cascaded toward the concrete floor, each glowing fragment carrying heat that would soon become coldness, abundance that would soon become victory. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The kamikaze came out of the sun without warning, its engine screaming like a banshee as it dove toward the USS Lexington's flight deck. Bobby Keller was checking tie-down cables when the explosion lifted him off his feet and slammed him against a bulkhead hard enough to crack his ribs. Smoke and flames engulfed the deck. Twisted, metal rained from the sky. Men screamed for corpsmen while others fought fires with foam and seawater. The smell of burning fuel mixed with something worse, the sweet stench of burning flesh that would haunt Bobby's dreams for decades. When the flames finally died and the smoke cleared, 47 men were gone, disappeared, vaporized, reduced to dog tags and memories and letters that would never be sent home. The ship's chaplain moved among the survivors like a ghost, offering prayers and comfort to men who had looked death in the face and seen their own mortality reflected back. That night, as the ship limped toward a repair anchorage, an officer appeared on deck carrying a box of paper cups. Inside each cup was something that seemed obscene in the aftermath of such violence: vanilla ice cream, white and pure and cold as snow. Bobby stared at his cup for a long time before tasting it. The sweetness hit his tongue like an insult to the dead, like a mockery of everything they had just endured. How could he enjoy ice cream when good men lay dead? How could dessert coexist with destruction? But then he understood. The ice cream wasn't celebrating their survival, it was defying their mortality. It was proof that even after witnessing hell, life still contained sweetness worth preserving. Each spoonful was an act of rebellion against death itself, a declaration that they would continue to fight, not just for survival, but for the right to taste vanilla on summer evenings when this war was finally over. Around him, other sailors ate in silence. Some cried while they ate. Others stared at the horizon where stars reflected off calm water. All of them tasted something more than ice cream. They tasted home, hope, and the promise that America's abundance was stronger than any enemy's hatred. The ship's ice cream plant had survived the attack intact, its refrigeration units still humming below decks. Production would continue. Tomorrow there would be more cones, more sweetness, more small victories against the darkness that threatened to swallow them all. Bobby finished his ice cream and set the empty cup beside a folded American flag that covered his friend's personal effects. The contrast was stark and perfect. Vanilla melting beside stars and stripes, dessert and death, united in the simple truth that both were part of war. Matsumoto's morning briefing contained numbers that read like a suicide note written in statistics. Japanese merchant shipping losses had reached 80%. The combined fleet was reduced to 18 operational vessels. Aircraft production had fallen to 12 planes daily, barely enough to replace training accidents, much less combat losses. Meanwhile, his intelligence staff reported that American ice cream ships were multiplying across the Pacific like some impossible plague of prosperity. Hospital ships served ice cream to wounded soldiers. Transport vessels carried refrigeration equipment to forward bases. Even submarines returning from patrol were greeted with frozen desserts. Major Tanaka spread reconnaissance photographs across the conference table. American naval anchorages filled with ships that bristled with cooling towers instead of gun turrets. Sir, they have converted at least 40 vessels for ice cream production. The industrial capacity required— Matsumoto didn't let him finish. The industrial capacity required was exactly the point. While Japan stripped Buddhist temples of their bronze bells to make artillery shells, America was manufacturing luxury items for soldiers who might die tomorrow. The message was clear. We have so much that we can afford to waste it. He walked to the window and stared out at Tokyo, where citizens had begun dismantling their homes to feed the war machine. Wooden houses disappeared board by board. Their materials shipped to aircraft factories, metal pots and pans vanished into munitions plants. Even children's toys were confiscated if they contained usable materials. Captain Sato cleared his throat nervously. Sir, our pilots report that American sailors taunt them during attacks. They hold up ice cream cones and wave them at our aircraft. The psychological warfare was more devastating than any bomb. Japanese pilots, flying planes held together with wire and prayers, burning fuel made from pine roots, watched enemy sailors eating dessert while missiles exploded around them. Some pilots returned to base and simply walked away from their aircraft, unable to reconcile the disparity. Matsumoto returned to his desk and opened his leather journal. His brush trembled as he wrote, "The war is not being lost on battlefields. It is being lost in ice cream factories, refrigeration plants, and dairy farms that continue to operate while our nation consumes itself. We face an enemy that has weaponized abundance itself. He closed the journal and locked it in his desk drawer. Tomorrow he would write similar entries. Next week the numbers would be worse. The retreat would continue until Japan was reduced to ashes and memories, defeated not just by superior firepower but by the crushing weight of an industrial civilization that could fight a total war while never forgetting what peace tasted like. Commander, Stedman stood before a wall of charts in the Pentagon's basement briefing room, each graph telling the story of America's most unusual military triumph. The final statistics of the Navy's ice cream program were staggering enough to defy belief, yet every number had been verified by 3 separate accounting departments. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled officers, "by war's end we served 80 million gallons of ice cream to our forces in the Pacific, enough to provide every serviceman with a cone weekly, even while under fire." Admiral Richardson, who had initially opposed the program, studied the production charts with something approaching awe. This single barge produced more ice cream monthly than the entire Japanese Empire consumed in dairy products annually. The mathematics of abundance spread across display boards like a celebration of American industrial might. 47 converted. Vessels operating simultaneously, 10 gallons produced every 7 minutes, 24 hours daily. Refrigeration equipment that functioned flawlessly despite temperatures reaching 110 degrees and explosions that could be felt 50 miles away. Captain O. Morrison pointed to comparative resource allocation charts. The entire ice cream program consumed less than 0.1% of our total war production, less steel than 3 destroyers, less fuel than a single carrier group burned in 1 week, less electrical equipment than a medium-sized city. But the real revelation lay in the strategic implications. While Japan had achieved maximum military efficiency by eliminating every luxury, every comfort, every reminder of peacetime life, America had proven that superior abundance made such sacrifices unnecessary. Ice cream hadn't weakened American fighting capacity, it had strengthened it. Morale reports indicate that units with regular ice cream access showed 23% lower rates of combat fatigue, 18% fewer requests for psychiatric evaluation, and 31% higher reenlistment rates, Stedman continued. Ice cream wasn't a luxury program, it was a force multiplication system. The charts showed American production capacity dwarfing all enemy nations combined. While Japan melted temple bells for bullets, America built ice cream factories. While Germany rationed bread, American soldiers ate dessert in foxholes. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Enemies who witnessed such casual abundance often surrendered without fighting. Admiral Richardson signed the final program evaluation with satisfaction. Recommendation: continue ice cream production. Capabilities in all future naval operations. If we fight another war, our enemies should know from the first day that we can afford to serve dessert while destroying them. Stedman gathered his charts and reports, each page documenting how democracy's greatest strength wasn't its military tradition, but its capacity to wage total war while maintaining the very way of life that made victory worth achieving. Ruth listened to President Roosevelt's voice crackling through the factory's radio speakers, his words echoing across the production floor where women continued welding refrigeration units even as peace was declared. The war was over, but the assembly lines kept running, habit, momentum, and the simple truth that stopping seemed impossible after years of ceaseless production. The American worker, Roosevelt declared, has proven that democracy's greatest weapon is not our tanks or planes, but our capacity to produce everything needed for victory while maintaining the very freedoms we fight to preserve. Ruth set down her welding torch and pulled off her mask, listening as the president praised the production miracles that had buried enemies under an avalanche of American abundance. 19 million women had joined the workforce during the war. Factories had multiplied their output by factors that seemed impossible. The United States had built enough refrigeration equipment to cool every home in Europe while simultaneously manufacturing ice cream machines for soldiers fighting in tropical heat. She thought about Tommy's letters, particularly the last one, that had arrived just before the surrender. He had described standing in line for ice cream aboard a hospital ship, sharing vanilla cones with Marines who had survived Okinawa. It wasn't just dessert, he had written. It was proof that America could fight the worst war in history and still remember what we were fighting for. Now the factory would retool again, returning to peacetime production of tractors and combines and farm equipment. But Ruth knew she would never forget the years when her welding torch had been a weapon of war, when every rivet she placed had contributed to victory, when abundance itself had been deployed like artillery against enemies who had forgotten what abundance meant. The other women on her shift gathered around the radio, some crying, some laughing, all of them proud of what they had accomplished. They had built the machines that kept ice cream cold while bombs exploded overhead. They had welded the victory that tasted like vanilla. During her break, Ruth walked to the loading dock where trains still waited to carry refrigeration equipment west. But now the cargo would serve peacetime purposes: ice cream parlors in rebuilt cities, cooling systems for hospitals, freezers for grocery stores where families would shop without ration cards. She pulled out Tommy's photograph and smiled through her tears. He would be coming home to a nation that had proven abundance and victory were not contradictory but complementary, that a people strong enough to serve ice cream in war zones was strong enough to build a peace worth preserving. 40 years later, Bobby Keller sat on his front porch in Iowa, watching his 5-year-old grandson Danny attack a vanilla ice cream cone with the focused intensity that only children could bring to such important work. Fireworks exploded overhead, painting the July sky with colors that reminded him of tracer rounds and muzzle flashes, but without the terror that had once accompanied such lights. The cone dripped onto Danny's shirt, and Bobby laughed at the sight. "Slow down there, soldier. It's not going anywhere." "Grandpa, why do you always call ice cream soldier food?" Danny asked, vanilla coating his chin like war paint. Bobby considered the question while fireflies began their nightly dance across the cornfield behind his house. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that ice cream had once been a weapon of war, that frozen dessert had helped defeat enemies who couldn't imagine such abundance, that vanilla cones served in the middle of battles had proven democracy's greatest strength? "Well," Bobby said slowly, "during the war we had ships that made ice cream for the sailors." Danny's eyes widened. "Ships made ice cream? In the ocean?" "The ocean? While we were fighting. The Navy decided that American boys deserved a taste of home, even when home was 10,000 miles away." He didn't mention the kamikaze attacks or the friends who had died before tasting their last cone. He didn't describe the Japanese officers who had written in their journals about the psychological devastation of fighting an enemy that could spare entire vessels for dessert. He didn't explain how abundance itself had become America's most devastating weapon. Instead, Bobby simply said, "It meant we had enough steel to build fighting ships and ice cream ships, enough food to feed our soldiers and still have plenty left over, enough strength to win the war and still remember what we were fighting for." Danny finished his cone and leaned against his grandfather's knee. "Will there be ice cream ships if there's another war?" Bobby looked up at the fireworks blooming like flowers against the summer sky. Somewhere in the distance, a marching band played the Star-Spangled Banner while families gathered on lawns and porches, sharing dessert and stories and the simple pleasure of being free. "I hope there won't be another war," he said quietly. "But if there is, we'll have ice cream ships, because that's what America does. We fight hard enough to win, and we live well enough to remember why winning matters." The last firework faded into stars, and Bobby whispered words his grandson was too young to understand. "We had enough to fight, and enough to share. The world did not forget the ice cream ships. In the years that followed the war, the tale spread quietly at first, through letters read at kitchen tables, stories told over bar stools, or anecdotes muttered by veterans whose eyes still carried the shadows of kamikazes and the brilliance of sudden sweetness. But as decades passed, the improbable truth, ships built to make ice cream in the midst of the greatest conflict in human history, became a parable, repeated in classrooms, history books, and museums. The story was never really about dessert. It was about what dessert meant. For men like Bobby Keller, ice cream never again arrived without memory. A paper cone handed over a counter in Iowa, a dish served at his granddaughter's birthday, a carton lifted from the freezer late at night. Each taste became an echo of the Pacific, of fire and smoke, and then, miraculously, cold vanilla on the tongue. As he aged, Bobby found himself telling the story more often, not always in full, but in fragments that captured its impossible truth. He told his students when he became a teacher, framing the lesson not in dates and battles, but in the image of sailors lining up for cones while enemies watched in disbelief. He told the men at the VFW, who nodded silently, understanding that sometimes victory arrived not through strategy or firepower, but through small luxuries that reminded you why survival mattered. He told his children and grandchildren, though he softened the edges for them, letting the story carry joy rather than terror. The ice cream ships became part of his personal mythology. Each veteran has one, a story that crystallizes the war into something that can be born, repeated, and passed down without breaking under the weight of everything else that cannot be said. For Bobby, the ice cream story carried the unbearable truth that sweetness had coexisted with slaughter, that a cone of vanilla could be both a mockery and a miracle, both an insult to the dead and a promise to the living. In Japan, Lieutenant Haruo Matsumoto survived the war, though barely. He lived to see Tokyo reduced to ashes, his own family surviving on black market rice, his children's hair falling out from malnutrition. When the surrender came, he wrote in his journal, not of the emperor's broadcast or the formal ceremonies, but of the ice cream ships. Defeat was already certain, he recorded, but it was made unbearable by the realization that they could afford to sweeten war while we could only taste bitterness. Years later, as Japan rebuilt itself into an industrial powerhouse, Matsumoto taught his students, first in military academies, later in civilian universities, that the war had been lost not only on battlefields, but in factories, farms, and even dairies. He described the ice cream ships as a metaphor for industrial civilization, a reminder that national strength was measured not only by tanks and planes, but by the ability to preserve comfort even in chaos. His students, raised in a nation where dessert once again became abundant, sometimes laughed at the absurdity of the story. Matsumoto never smiled when he told it. To him, the ice cream ships were the sharpest weapon America ever wielded, a reminder that scarcity crushes the spirit as surely as bombs destroy buildings. In Wisconsin, Ruth O'Malley returned to civilian life. The factory that had once welded refrigeration units for the Navy's floating parlors returned to building tractors and combines, and Ruth went back to farm work with her husband. Yet she carried the knowledge that her hands had contributed to something larger than any field or harvest. When her brother Tommy came home, lean and older than his years but alive, he hugged her so tightly she thought her ribs would crack. Only then did she tell him about the refrigeration units, about the endless sparks and smoke, about the trains that vanished into the horizon night after night. Tommy laughed through tears. "So it was you," he said. "You're the reason. I had ice cream after Okinawa." Ruth never thought of it as a waste. She saw the weld seams in her mind every time she opened the door of the farm's icebox. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that abundance was not accidental. It was manufactured, welded, riveted, built by millions of hands working without sleep. Abundance was not just America's gift, it was its greatest weapon, its truest defense, and its most enduring promise. When the Smithsonian mounted an exhibit on the home front in World War II in the 1980s, one display case held a rusted crank churn, a faded paper cone, and a navy blueprint marked with the words "Ice Cream Barge Conversion, 1944." Veterans brought their grandchildren to see it. Some laughed, some cried. Some stood silently, lost in memories that museums cannot capture. The curators debated whether to present the ice cream ships as trivia, morale boosters, or industrial marvels. In the end, they framed it as all three. A plaque beneath the exhibit bore a quote from a sailor's diary. "We thought it was a rumor until the first cone melted in our hands. Then we knew America would win because only a nation that could make ice cream in a war zone could never be beaten." By the 21st century, the story of the ice cream ships had been retold in documentaries, novels, and classrooms. Some dismissed it as propaganda or exaggeration. Historians confirmed the facts: 2 concrete barges converted into floating ice cream factories, dozens of ships equipped with freezers and churns, tens of millions of gallons produced across the Pacific. The numbers, absurd as they seemed, were true, but the truth of the story was never just numerical, it was symbolic. It was about the meaning of fighting a war without losing sight of why you fought. It was about the refusal to surrender small pleasures, the insistence that democracy and abundance could survive even in firestorms. For Bobby's grandson Danny, who grew up hearing the story every 4th of July, the lesson outlasted the details. He became a teacher himself, telling his students not just about battles and treaties, but about ice cream in the Pacific. History, he told them, is not just about who won and lost. It's about what they remembered to carry with them while they were fighting. Sometimes it's not the guns that explain victory, but the cones. Time, as it always does, carried away the witnesses. Bobby passed on, his obituary noting his service aboard the USS Lexington. Ruth was buried beside her husband in a small Wisconsin cemetery, her children remembering her as both farmer and welder. Matsumoto's journal, discovered by his grandson, became a source for historians studying the psychological dimensions of defeat. But the story they all lived through, the story of desert turned into a weapon, remained. It was preserved in archives, repeated at parades, whispered in bedtime stories, when veterans tried to explain to their grandchildren how a nation could both destroy and create at once. And so the ice cream ships endured, not as curiosities, but as emblems. They reminded future generations that strength lies not only in firepower, but in the ability to preserve joy amid terror. They reminded the world that victory comes not from stripping life of sweetness, but from multiplying it until enemies cannot comprehend the scale. What does it mean when a nation can fight a total war and still build ships for ice cream? It means the nation has mastered the art of fighting without surrendering the reason to fight. It means democracy has proven that abundance and survival are not enemies, but allies. It means that even in the darkest hours of human history, there can still be laughter, sweetness, and a paper cone passed from hand to hand in defiance of despair. The Japanese commanders were right to be shocked. The ice cream ships were not luxuries. They were declarations. They said, "We have enough. Enough to fight, enough to share, enough to remember that life is worth more than survival." And perhaps that was the sweetest weapon of all. If you enjoyed this story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.